It was April 1943. Coventry still smelled of ash. In a quiet hospital ward, a young British soldier woke to the sound of distant sirens. His head was wrapped in gauze, his lungs burned with smoke, and his memory flickered like a broken reel of film. The last thing he remembered was a flash, a roaring wall of fire swallowing the street, and then, her. A woman's voice, trembling but steady. "Hold on, lad. You're going to make it." He had seen her face only for a second, framed by dust, streaked with soot, eyes full of defiance. Then darkness claimed him. When he awoke days later, no one knew who she was. The nurses said a woman had dragged several soldiers from the rubble before disappearing. No name, no address, just a rumor, the woman in the red coat. 4 months, he thought of her. Through every bombing raid, every night spent under iron skies, every letter he wrote to his mother, he carried that image, the woman who had saved his life and vanished like smoke. But as the war grew bloodier, memories turned into ghosts. People disappeared faster than hope. Soldiers went missing, families fled, cities fell. Finding one woman in the chaos of a burning continent seemed impossible. And yet, years later, long after the guns fell silent and the world began to rebuild, a letter arrived. Its handwriting was shaky, its paper yellowed with time. Inside was a single line. "I never thought you'd survive that night. But I'm glad you did." It was signed, Margaret. The soldier's hands trembled. The name he'd waited years to hear. Who was she? How did she survive? And what secret had kept her hidden all these years? Before the letter, before the smoke, before history swallowed entire cities, there was Coventry, a city of factories and faith, of cobblestone streets and ringing church bells. It was 1940, and Britain was already bleeding. By autumn, German bombers had turned the skies into hunting grounds. Every night, sirens screamed. Every morning, the city counted its dead. But in the daylight, people pretended normal life could still exist. Shops reopened. Children went to school. Trains still came and went, though everyone knew they could be the next target. Among them was Private Thomas Hale, 23 years old, freshly enlisted in the British Army. He had joined not out of glory, but guilt. His father had fought in the Great War and come back broken, a man haunted by gas and trenches. Thomas swore he'd be different. He'd fight for a cause worth dying for, not just survive it. He was stationed near Coventry when the first great raid came. November 14, 1940. Operation Moonlight Sonata. The Luftwaffe sent more than 500 bombers. Their goal: cripple the city's factories and morale in one night. By 8 p.m., the city was a furnace. Incendiaries fell like rain. Firefighters couldn't keep up. The sky glowed orange for miles, visible even from London. Thomas had been on leave that night. He'd been walking toward his boarding house, carrying a tin of tea for his landlady, when the first explosion ripped through the street. Glass shattered. Smoke swallowed everything. He dove behind a wall, but the next blast tore it apart. When he woke, he couldn't move his legs. He could barely breathe. Through the haze, he saw shapes. People screaming, running, falling. Then a shadow approached. A woman, her hair pulled back, her coat once red, now dusted with ash. She looked at him, eyes fierce, determined. "You're not dying here," she said. He wanted to ask her name, but she was already pulling at the rubble, gritting her teeth as she dragged him toward a basement doorway. Another bomb fell, closer this time. She shielded him with her body, whispering prayers he couldn't hear over the roar. And then, nothing. He woke days later in an emergency ward, surrounded by stretchers and bodies under white sheets. Nurses told him the woman had vanished before the medics arrived. Some said she'd gone back into the flames to save others. Some said she hadn't made it. Thomas didn't believe that. He couldn't. He'd seen the defiance in her eyes, the kind that didn't break easily. When the war spread across Europe, Thomas was sent to North Africa, then Italy. He became hardened, leaner, quieter. The kind of soldier who didn't talk about home. But every time he saw a red coat, a flash of auburn hair, or heard a woman's voice under the wail of sirens, something stirred. He never found her. Not in reports, not in hospital logs, not even in whispers among the locals. The woman in the red coat was a ghost. Years later, when he returned to a rebuilt Coventry, he walked its new streets, streets where rubble had become stone again. The cathedral lay in ruins, preserved as a scar. Around it, new homes stood proud, clean, and bright. But to Thomas, every brick carried memory of the night he should have died, and the woman who refused to let him. He lived quietly, worked as a postman, tried to forget the war. But on gray mornings, when the rain smelled like smoke, the past returned. Then came the letter. No return address. No date. Just a name, Margaret. And with it, a choice, to let the ghost remain a ghost, or to find out who she truly was. Thomas Hale held the letter for hours before opening it again. He'd read it a dozen times, tracing every word like a man deciphering a code. I never thought you'd survive that night. But I'm glad you did. Margaret. That was all. No address, no date, no hint of where she might be. Only the soft, trembling handwriting, careful, deliberate, like someone who had written through tears. He turned the envelope over, searching for clues. The postmark was smudged but faintly legible, Lincolnshire. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the same jolt of urgency he'd felt in battle. He packed a small bag, grabbed his worn-out coat, and boarded the first train north. The countryside rolled past the window, green and gray and endless. Bomb scars dotted the land, craters now filled with rainwater, half-collapsed barns, memorials carved into stone. Each one reminded him how much had been lost, how easily lives were erased. He arrived in Lincolnshire with one name and a memory. It wasn't much. He started at the post office, showing the letter to clerks who shook their heads kindly. Then he tried the church records, asking after any Margaret who might have been in Coventry during the Blitz. Dozens, the vicar told him. Half the country was named Margaret back then. But one lead stood out. A woman at a local bakery mentioned an older nurse who had once worked with the Coventry emergency crews during the bombings. She moved out here after the war, the woman said. Keeps to herself. Kind. Quiet. Lives by the coast now. Thomas thanked her and left, his heart pounding. It wasn't proof, but it was something. Days later, he found her cottage. White walls. Ivy creeping up the sides. The sea wind carried the scent of salt and pine. He hesitated at the gate, staring at the door. He had faced enemy fire, crossed minefields, crawled through mud under artillery fire. But this felt harder. He knocked. The door opened slowly. A woman stood before him, gray hair tied neatly, eyes soft but weary. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "You're late," she said. Thomas froze. "You remember me?" She smiled faintly. "How could I forget?" They sat by the fireplace, two ghosts from the same war, bound by one night that neither could forget. Margaret told him what had happened after that bombing. She had been a volunteer nurse, barely 20 at the time. When the raid began, she was helping evacuate children. Then the bombs started falling faster. She found Thomas buried under debris, barely breathing. She dragged him to shelter, but before the medics arrived, the street collapsed behind her. "I went back," she said quietly. "There were others trapped. I thought I could save more. But the second blast, I don't remember much after that. I woke up in a field hospital. They said everyone on that street had died. I believed them. For years, I believed you had too." Thomas sat in silence, watching the fire dance between them. "Why right now?" he asked softly. She hesitated. "Because the nightmares never stopped. I saw your face every time I closed my eyes. And when I heard your name in a memorial registry, I thought maybe you'd lived. So I wrote. I didn't expect you'd come." He smiled faintly. "I've come a long way to say thank you." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was not awkward, it was sacred. Two lives, torn by war, stitched back together by gratitude. But as they talked, something darker emerged. Margaret revealed that after Coventry, she had joined a volunteer group that helped track down survivors. Many of her records had been destroyed when the government offices were bombed, but she'd kept copies, hidden in a tin box. Some of the names on those lists, she whispered, were never supposed to be found again. What do you mean? Thomas asked. She looked into the fire. There were civilians misidentified as casualties. People sent away under false names. Some were spies. Some were children hidden for safety. The war erased a lot more than buildings. Thomas leaned forward. You knew about this all along? I tried to report it, she said. They told me to forget, to let the past rest. But she hadn't. She'd carried that burden for decades, the guilt of knowing the truth, the loneliness of silence. And now, seeing Thomas alive, it felt like redemption. In that cottage by the sea, the ghosts of Coventry finally spoke their truths. They talked until dawn, about fear, duty, loss, and what it meant to survive when others didn't. As the first light crept through the window, Margaret handed him the tin box. Inside were faded papers, names, dates, addresses, a record of those who were lost and those who weren't supposed to be found. This is your story too, she said. It doesn't belong to me anymore. Thomas realized that the woman who had saved him from the bombing had also saved something else, a piece of forgotten history, sealed away for decades. And for the first time in years, he felt that the war wasn't entirely over. Not yet. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat at the small wooden table, the tin box open before him, its contents spread across a faded tablecloth. The papers smelled faintly of dust and sea salt. Some were typed reports, others were handwritten notes, hurriedly scribbled, smudged by time. One list caught his eye: unconfirmed civilian fatalities, Coventry, 1940. There, among dozens of names, was his own, Private Thomas Hale, presumed dead, November 14, 1940. He stared at it for a long moment. He had been officially dead for years. Margaret spoke quietly beside him. After the fire, they cleared the street where you were found. They thought no one survived. I tried to tell them otherwise, but by then, communications were chaos. I was just a volunteer. No one listened. Thomas's chest tightened. All those years his mother had waited for letters that never came. All those nights she must have cried over a name carved into a memorial. He clenched his jaw. They buried me, Margaret, while I was still alive. I know, she whispered, and I'm sorry. He looked at her, not with anger, but with the heavy understanding of someone who had seen too much loss to waste it on blame. You saved my life, he said. That's all that matters. But there was something else in that box. Something that didn't belong. A sealed envelope, marked confidential. Its wax seal was cracked, but the paper still bore the crest of the Ministry of Home Security. Thomas hesitated, then unfolded it carefully. Inside was a memorandum dated December 1940. It detailed a covert operation, the evacuation of intelligence officers hidden among civilians in bombed cities. Their deaths had been faked to protect their identities. Dozens of names. Men and women who had died in Coventry, Bristol, and London. Margaret looked pale. I shouldn't have kept that, she said. It's government property. Why did you? Thomas asked. Because I saw what it cost people, she replied. They erased lives to protect secrets. And no one ever questioned it. Thomas folded the paper and slid it back into the box. Then maybe it's time someone did. The morning tide roared outside. Wind howled against the windows. For a brief moment, the sound reminded him of sirens, those haunting echoes from Coventry. He turned to Margaret. You said this isn't just about me. Who else did they erase? She sighed. A nurse I worked with. Her name was Elsie Grant. She discovered one of the officers among the wounded, recognized him from a file she shouldn't have seen. 2 days later, she vanished. They said she died in another bombing, but there was no record. I started collecting what I could after that. For her. For everyone. Thomas nodded slowly. Then we finish what she started. They spent hours sorting through the papers, cataloging every name and date. Many were beyond tracing, ghosts lost to the tide of war. But a few were different. One in particular stood out, Captain James Ainsley. The file noted he'd been relocated after Coventry under a new identity. Thomas frowned. I know that name. He commanded my unit in North Africa. We thought he'd been reassigned. No one ever said why. Margaret met his eyes. You understand now why they buried you with the others. They needed the dead to stay dead. The realization hit him hard. The night he was pulled from the rubble, someone had already decided he was expendable. His survival wasn't supposed to happen. And yet, here he was, alive because a stranger had defied the flames. By evening, they had assembled a full record of the cover-up. Margaret's hands trembled as she placed the papers back in the box. If anyone finds out we have this. They won't, Thomas interrupted. But the truth deserves to live somewhere. He stood, staring out the window toward the darkening sea. So many of us fought to save our country from lies. Maybe it's time the country faced its own. Margaret smiled sadly. You sound like your father. He turned to her. You knew him? She nodded. I treated him in the Great War. He was injured at Ypres.
Brave Mann.
Quiet. Just like you. For a long time, they sat in silence. Two survivors connected by the threads of fate. Then, Thomas took her hand. You saved my life twice, Margaret. Once from the bombs, and once from forgetting who I am. Tears welled in her eyes. And you reminded me why I risked everything that night. The storm outside grew stronger, the wind lashing against the glass. Yet inside the small cottage, there was warmth, not from the fire, but from something deeper. When dawn broke again, Thomas packed the tin box in his coat. He promised Margaret he would keep it safe, that the truth would not vanish with time. As he stepped outside, the horizon burned with soft gold. The sea shimmered. For the first time since the war, he felt peace. Margaret watched from the doorway, her silhouette framed by morning light. Goodbye, Thomas, she whispered. He turned, smiled faintly, and tipped his cap. No, Margaret. Thank you. He walked down the path toward the village, the wind carrying the faint echo of church bells, the same sound that once marked the beginning of the bombing. Only now, it sounded like a hymn. Years later, when Thomas Hale's name was finally restored in the war archives, few people noticed. The correction appeared quietly in a government bulletin, a single line among hundreds of others. Private Thomas Hale, confirmed survivor of the Coventry Blitz, 1940. But behind that one line lay an entire life that had once been erased. Thomas never sought recognition. He continued his simple work as a postman, walking through streets that had risen from ashes. Each morning, as he delivered letters, he thought about the one that had changed everything, the trembling handwriting that had brought him back to the past, and to her. He kept Margaret's letter in his breast pocket, worn and folded, like a medal no government could issue. The tin box he entrusted to a small museum in Coventry, not the Grand War Memorial, but a quiet one run by locals who had lived through the Blitz. He asked for no plaque, no story, just that the names inside never be forgotten again. When the curator asked what the box contained, Thomas said simply, truth, and the people who refused to die quietly. In Lincolnshire, Margaret's cottage remained by the sea, still white and peaceful, the ivy climbing higher every year. She grew frilier with time, her hands no longer steady enough to write, but her mind sharp as ever. Some evenings, she'd sit by the fire, watching the flames flicker like the memories she once feared. One spring morning, she received a package. Inside was a small framed photograph, Coventry Cathedral in ruins, with a note. The world burns and rebuilds, but kindness survives the fire. It wasn't signed. It didn't have to be. When Margaret passed away a year later, her neighbors found the photograph on her nightstand, facing the window. Beneath it lay the red coat she had worn that terrible night, faded now to a dull crimson, but still carrying the scent of smoke and courage. Thomas attended her funeral quietly, standing at the back. Few people knew who he was. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. When the service ended, he placed a single poppy on her coffin, bright red against the pale wood, and whispered, "Rest easy now, Margaret. The war's finally over." As he walked away, the wind carried the distant sound of gulls and waves crashing against the cliffs. The same sea that had once surrounded Britain in war now whispered peace. In his final years, Thomas became known in the village as the man who wrote letters by hand. Children saw him sitting by his window, penning pages in careful cursive. No one knew who he was writing to. In truth, every letter began the same way. "Dear Margaret." He never stopped writing to her. He told her about the world she helped rebuild, about the peace she'd made possible, about the quiet bravery that lived on in those who remembered. When he passed away in 1983, the local paper printed a small obituary. It read, "Thomas Hale, 66, war veteran and postman, survived the Coventry Blitz, known for his kindness and handwritten letters." The museum curator found another envelope inside the tin box, written in the same careful hand as before. It contained a single sentence. "For the woman in the red coat, the one who taught me that survival means more than living." No signature. No name. Just the words that bound two lives together across the ruins of war. And as the rain fell softly on the roof of the museum, dripping down the glass cases of history, it seemed, for a moment, that somewhere, the world paused to remember them both. In the silence that followed, the city remembered everything.